All right. Hey, so everything check out?
Yep.
All right. Hey, so I'm Lee Wright, founder of History Camp. I'm outside of Boston, and with me tonight from Virginia is.
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of the Pursuit of History, and we are excited to have with us tonight Christ Klein. He is the author of When the Irish Invaded Canada, the incredible true story of the Civil War veterans who fought for Ireland's freedom. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
I'm glad to do it, Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, it's great to have you. You've been such a super friend and supporter of History Camp, presenting at several of those, and we'll actually come back and talk about it at the end. But wanted to thank you for participating tonight. You know, this is a great example of, I think, one of the reasons people love these talks, and that's to learn about something that they had no idea of. And my guess is that for most people listening tonight, this will be a completely new lesson in history.
Yep.
Set the stage. Would you give us an idea what was going on in Canada, the United States, Ireland at this time?
All right. So when the Irish invaded Canada sounds like a bunch of blarney, but it's completely true story. And in fact, there's an Irish-American army that invades Canada not just once, but 5 times between 1866 and 1871 in what are known as the Fenian raids. So, you know, the natural reaction is, well, why would anyone want to attack, you know, sweet, peaceable Canada? But I think part of it is we've got to go back in history to really do set that stage for us. You know, Canada at that time, it's part of Great Britain, so it's not under the maple leaf flag that we know. It's under the Union Jack, and to the Irish, you know, it's a hated symbol. You know, if you're going to use today's parlance, you would say that the Irish invaded Canada were radicalized by their experience of living under British rule. And the luck of the Irish was not something that you wanted to have for about 7 centuries of history, because the Irish had the poor fortune of being right in the backyard of the world's greatest empire, and they were colonized by the British. And life was pretty tough if you were Irish, and if you're in particular were an Irish Catholic living under British rule. You were not allowed under the penal laws in the 1700s. If you were an Irish Catholic, you were not allowed to hold public office or vote or freely worship, send your child to a Catholic teacher. You weren't allowed to own a horse that was worth more than 5 pounds, or even have any sort of firearms. You were allowed to have 1 knife in your house as long as it was chained down to a table. And even in death, your rights were restricted. You weren't allowed to have a Catholic priest preside over a graveside ceremony at a cemetery. And so for 7 centuries, the Irish think that the British are trying to take away their language and their culture and their freedom and their religion. And then when the potato crop fails in the 1840s, there's a group of militant Irish who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether. And you have then a great exodus during the Great Hunger in Ireland, where you will have 2 million Irish are going to flee the country. 1 million of them are going to come to American shores. And when they come to America, they don't forget what happened in their homeland. They will not forget the terrible pain that they went through during the Great Hunger, and it's going to stay with them for a couple decades after being in the United States, when the most radical of these Irish nationalists are going to try to bring freedom to Ireland. They're going to do that by trying to attack the closest piece of British territory they can find in the United States, and that's Canada.
You know, I think it's hard for us today to understand the depth of the famine and just that immense human cost and human loss.
I mean, so the population of Ireland at the time of when the potato crop starts to fail in 1845, the population of Ireland is about 8 million people. It's still not back to 8 million people now. I mean, it's just left a giant hole for generations and generations that still has not been recovered at this point. And there's a lot of psychologists sort of have studied this, and those who went through it carried this malignant shame, is what they called it, and it really impacted the history of Irish America in those decades afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so that's the stage. So then take us then forward. What was going on in the United States? Who were the people that were leading this effort? And then it sounds like not just one invasion, not just two invasions, not just three invasions. So take us through.
All right. So you have in the United States, when all of a sudden you have 1 million Irish pouring into the country, there's going to be a big reaction to it as well. And the Irish who come to the United States are unlike any newcomers that the country had seen before in its 70 years of its history. For one thing, they're really refugees more than immigrants. They're not hungering for American ideals as much as literally starving for food. They're different in that a quarter of them don't speak the language, in the English language. They speak Irish. And what really sets them apart is that they're practicing what is an alien religion to many Americans in that time, and that's Catholicism. And you have a country that was founded on very Protestant foundation, and the Catholics coming into this country in such numbers really leads to a disruption. And you have a backlash in the country in the 1850s under what is the rise of the know-nothings, the rise of political nativism that really hits its zenith in 1854 when nativism is running so amok in the country that a group of know-nothings break into the construction site on the Washington Monument to steal a block of marble that was donated by the Pope to be put into the monument. And the know-nothings think that this is a signal for an uprising of Catholics in the country to install a second Vatican in, of all places, Cincinnati. And you also then, at the polls, the know-nothings have great success in 1854. They win the state houses in quite a number of states in the Northeast. In Massachusetts, they get all but 3 seats in the state house. They sweep all the statewide offices, and they start to implement a program that includes the use of the King James Bible in public schools and deportation of Irish. There's investigations into Catholic rectories and nunneries. So you have this real backlash against the Irish. And the way that the Irish were able to survive 7 centuries of British rule was to sort of turn inward, coil itself like a snake for protection. And they're going to do the same thing when they come to the United States. So they will become very clannish and cling together in organizations such as the Ancient Order of Hibernians and church parishes. And then in 1858, there's a new organization that is started called the Fenian Brotherhood. And this is an Irish revolutionary organization. And it was started by 2 Irishmen who were part of the Young Ireland Revolution in 1848 that was a failed uprising. And their names were James Stephens and John O'Mahony. And James Stephens in Ireland forms a group called the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And John O'Mahony comes to the United States to form a sister organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And the idea is that in the United States, all the Irish exilers are going to raise money and weapons. They're going to ship it back to Ireland, where James Stephens is going to raise an army, and they're going to try another revolution inside of Ireland. So this is this transatlantic revolutionary organization is set up, and then, of course, a few years after it starts comes the Civil War, puts those plans on hold. Then in the wake of the Civil War, in 1865, the movement starts to gain a lot of momentum. You had 200,000 Irish who fought in the Civil War. So many of them gained a lot of experience with weapons. A lot of them end up with the weapons after the war. The plan is on place to do the revolution in Ireland, and then all of a sudden it falls apart. The British have infiltrated the organization. They arrest all the leaders. James Stephens is on the run. and this idea of having another revolution in Ireland is dead. So what is going on at the same time in the United States is the rise of a lot of the Fenians inside the organization say this whole idea of having a revolution in Ireland is crazy anyway. We don't even have a navy, let alone a single boat. So how can we possibly have a revolution in Ireland? Why don't we just go to the nearest piece of British territory, and that's Canada? So the failure of the revolution in Ireland gives its impetus to launch these invasions of Canada. So Canada really becomes the prime target in 1866. So in 1866, the Fenian Brotherhood has tens of thousands of members. It has its own Irish Republic in exile with a Capitol building in New York City, right on the north side of Union Square. They've sold war bonds. They've bought surplus American weapons, and they've formed their own army, which will become known as the Irish Republican Army. And they put together a war plan to invade Canada in the spring of 1866. And it's put together by Thomas William Sweeney, who was a general, a veteran of the Civil War. Plans a five-pronged invasion with amphibious launch of troops from Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo. And then it's all a feint for a big 17,000-man army that's going to march right up through the Lake Champlain Valley, seize Montreal, seize Quebec, and then take the St. Lawrence River, which is the chokehold on all Canadian trade. So that is the plan. The plan does not happen as it comes to fruition, and it has been infiltrated by American spies and Canadian spies. And Sweeney finds that there's no boats to be found in Chicago. No one's in Detroit. No one's in Cleveland. He does have 800 men in Buffalo. So that's what he's going to do. He's going to send 800 men in from Buffalo to launch the first invasion of Canada in May of 1866. And they get across the line. And I mean, I'm not sure how much detail you want to talk about this invasion by invasion here, but it's really this first invasion really is the high point, and it's got some interesting parts to it. So I'm not sure if you want me to just keep going on that end. So I think a couple interesting things here is one is that there's an 800-man army from Buffalo ready to go into Canada. The only thing that's standing between this Irish Republican Army marching through the streets of Buffalo and the Canadian territory on the other side of Niagara River is one American warship. Canadians do not have any forces on the other side. So there's the USS Michigan is the only thing standing between the Irish Republican Army and Canada. And so when the report gets to USS Michigan that this Irish army is marching through Buffalo, the captain of the ship gives the order to put the ship out in the Niagara River. But what the captain doesn't know is that there's actually a sleeper cell of 17 Fenians among his crew. And they know that that boat cannot go anywhere without its pilot, whose name happens to be Patrick Murphy. But don't let the name fool you. Patrick Murphy is a very loyal sailor. He had been part of the Royal Navy, part of the American Navy. So the Fenians know that for them to get over to Canada, they're going to have to take Patrick Murphy out. And by that, I don't mean killing him. They're going to take him out for a night on the town in Buffalo, so that when the captain of the USS Michigan gives the order for the ship to go out into the river, Patrick Murphy is nowhere to be found. He is being treated to lots of drinks in the saloons of Buffalo, and is seen stumbling down Main Street singing "The Wearing of the Green." So with that sabotage, the Irish American Army crosses the Niagara River in the dead of night and crosses into Canadian territory unmolested. And it takes them 24 hours before they actually encounter any Canadian Defense Forces. And they will do so 20 miles south of Niagara Falls in a small village called Ridgeway. And the Fenians are outnumbered, they're outgunned, but what they do have is experience. So of these 800 men, quite a number of them fought in the Civil War on both sides. You have soldiers wearing their Union blues, you have soldiers wearing their Confederate grays. They've come as far as New Orleans to fight in this battle. And John ONeill, who's the commander of these Fenians, is able to use that experience to his advantage. And the Canadian Defense Forces are so raw and young. Many of them never fired a gun. They include a regiment of students from the University of Toronto who got a knock on their door the night before saying, good news, you don't have to study for your finals anymore. Bad news is you need to be in downtown Toronto at 4 a.m. where you're going to be given a gun to repel the Southern invaders. So John ONeill has a much more experienced army. He does use it to his advantage. And in the Battle of Ridgeway, he emerges victorious. And it is it's a serious battle. There's 20 men who die on both sides. ONeill has to then circle back after this battle to Fort Erie, where he landed, and there's another running gun battle through the streets. But he finds that his supply lines have all been cut off by the American government, and he has to hightail it back to the United States. And before he leaves Canadian territory, he lines up all the prisoners that they've taken. And the Canadian prisoners figure that, well, they're about ready to face the firing squad. Instead, John ONeill will go down the line, shakes each Canadian's man's hand one by one, and vows that he's going to return with a bigger army. And John ONeill will be a man of his word, and he's going to return back, trying to launch invasions again in 1870 and 1871, sometimes with very farcical results. And at the end of when the Irish invaded Canada, you sort of have to wonder if the story of these Fenians is it a tragedy or a comic opera? It sort of gets a little bit crazy in some of these later invasions that they launch. But that is the real high point of these Irish invasions, and Ridgeway really is their high water mark.
So just take us through those years then. The first invasion was what year?
1866.
Okay. And then 4 years later?
4 years later in 1870.
And then 1871?
And then 1871. Yep.
And is there another after that?
No, 1871 is the last one.
So given what happened in 1866, was the U.S. government interested in trying to keep this in check, or did they just figure this is a problem for the Canadians?
They certainly weren't unhappy with what the Irish were doing here, and a lot of the reason is that during this time there's a lot of animosity between the United States government and the British government and the Canadian government because of what happened during the Civil War. So you have, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States government is trying to get millions of dollars in reparations from the British government under what were called the Alabama claims because of the damage done by Confederate warships that were built in British ports. So the American government was very happy to use the Fenians as leverage to try to pressure the British government to pay up on these Alabama claims. And there's also animosity towards the Canadians, too, because of what happened during the Civil War, because it's in Canada. It was a haven for, Union draft dodgers, escaped POWs. Also, it's where Confederate Secret Service had a cell up there that launched raids on banks in St. Albans. They attempted to firebomb New York City, and then there was thought that they were involved in possibly the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because John Wilkes Booth was supposedly seen in Montreal about a week before the assassination. So the United States government is quite happy to let the Fenians to turn a blind eye to what the Fenians are doing, to put pressure on the British government and on the Canadian government to settle the Alabama claims and sort of as payback for what happened during the Civil War. And that was probably one of the most surprising things in researching this book, is just really the tacit approval that was given to these invasions. Certainly in 1866 under Andrew Johnson, And then into the 1872, it's not really until the Treaty of Washington is signed between the British and Americans that settles these Alabama claims that really takes away any of the backing that the American government would have for any of the activities of the Irish Americans.
Step back for just a minute. The role of the Irish in the Civil War. Now, there was a brigade, is that right? That's kind of well known as being an Irish brigade.
This is the Irish Brigade. I mean, this surprised me too. So there's a scholar named Damien Shields who's done a lot of research into the participation of native-born Irish in the Civil War, and by his estimates, about 200,000 native Irish were fighting in the Civil War, and about 175,000 on the Union side, 25,000 on the Confederate side. And they were all over. It wasn't just in these Irish brigades. I mean, they were part of the standing Irish Army. They were serving out in the Union territories, in the Navy. They were in such sheer numbers. It's really astounding how large a part that Irish immigrants played in the American Civil War.
I'd imagine they were the largest immigrant group by far, weren't they?
I think so. I mean, you had large numbers of Germans in the country as well, but serving in the forces, I'd say that had to be the largest. Yeah.
And was there any particular motivation, philosophical motivation, or was it at that point the thing you did because your neighbors went off to war also?
Well, their primary motivation was monetary. It was a tough road for the Irish to hoe. They were still at the bottom of the economic ladder when the war starts. And for many Irish, they thought it would be a paycheck. They signed up in large numbers when it started, in 3-month increments, and no one thought the war was going to last that long. So for many, they're just doing it to get a paycheck. It's not necessarily out of any motivation to free the slaves, because that wasn't necessarily in their economic self-interest. A lot of times where they were fighting for the Union or Confederacy was just a simple matter of what port they had landed in and where they were living, and they were doing it as part of the cause. Now, what's interesting, though, is you do have members of the Fenian Brotherhood who are enlisting in the war, and they think that this is just going to be an excellent way for them to learn weaponry, learn military tactics, and they're going to use that experience and export it to the real war that they want to fight for freedom of Ireland, rather than freedom for the slaves. So for a lot of the Irish who are going to be involved in these invasions, their participation in the Civil War is also done with that in mind as well.
All right, so let's go back then. So we've got the invasion in 1866, which you characterize as kind of the high water mark, and it sounds like one of the things that forced them to retreat was the supply lines being cut off.
Yep.
So how successful were the leaders in recruiting men to 4 years later give it another go? So
John ONeill, who is the general who will lead them in battle in 1866, will then take over the leadership of the Fenian Brotherhood. And he is just, he's maniacal in his in his obsession with defeating the British. Now, John ONeill, he was born in Ireland. He learned great tales of the ONeill clan, who fought Queen Elizabeth I, men like Owen Roe ONeill and Hugh ONeill. So he learned about great members of his clan. And then when the potato crop failed, he saw his town decimated, lost 25% of its population, broke his family apart. They all ended up going to America, but at different times. And, so he's forced out of Ireland. He serves in the Civil War. But he really sees it as part of that he's been bred all along. He has this quote that, his grand purpose in life outside of his duty to his God was to be at the head of an Irish army battling England for Ireland's rights. So he just happened to be the right man at the right place at the right time when he's given the leadership in Buffalo to go in to lead this invasion. And he will never get rid of this idea of invading Canada. So in 1870, he's in charge of the organization. He put together a war plan. He's going to invade up through that route through Vermont, which was the original plan. And I should say, in a few days after the invasion of Buffalo in 1866, there is a group of Irishmen who will launch an invasion of southern Quebec from Vermont. They're in Canadian territory for about less than 72 hours before they're chased out by Canadian Defense Forces. No real battle is fought there. They pretty much had free reign in southern Quebec for a few days. John ONeill in 1870 is going to choose to enter Canada through that same exact road. But this time the Canadians are waiting for him right on the other side. So right in the town of Franklin, Vermont, he goes in through a dairy farm owned by a man named Alva Richard, who can't believe his eyes in 1870 when, for the second time in 4 years, he's got an Irish army marching down his road to invade Canada. This time, they're not a ragtag bunch in terms of how they look. They've all got these green uniforms on. They're called the Irish Republican Army. They have brass buttons on their jackets that say IRA. So John ONeill leads this group to the border, and when they're ready to cross, he doesn't know, but up on a hill overlooking the border are these Canadian sharpshooters. And when as soon as the Irish cross the border, the battle ensues, and they are just laid into from this high position. And for several hours, there's just this firefight on Alva Richard's dairy farm. This poor guy's got his farmhouse getting shot up, and he's complaining about all the soldiers tracking mud into his house and ruining his grandmother's quilt. But the John ONeill is turned away right at the border, and it leads to the end that the Irish are just throwing down their weapons and hightailing it back to safety. So the running joke after this battle is that the IRA on their uniforms stands for I ran away.
So we'll leave the last invasion to folks who pick up the book. And I know Carrie is getting together some questions. Let me switch gears to a couple of other things. You've written other books. Do you want to take us through at least a couple of those? I know
Sure.
At least two have been presentations at History Camp.
Yep. First one I did was a book called Discovering the Boston Harbor Islands, which is sort of part tour guide, part history about all 34 of the Boston Harbor Islands. I talked about that one at History Camp, talking about just the real interesting stories. A lot of events that happen on those islands connected to some of the major moments in American history, but then also some real quirky history out there as well. So that's a very interesting way to sort of look at the history of Boston through sort of a different lens. I did another book called The Die Hard Sports Fan's Guide to Boston, which again sort of took the same approach, but this time to Boston sports. Then I followed that up with a book called Strong Boy, which you can see over my shoulder here, which was a biography of John L. Sullivan, who was the first American sports superstar and the last of the bare-knuckled heavyweight champions. And his era was the Gilded Age, so I sort of see his story is sort of about Irish Americans coming of age, that first generation born in the United States, sort of the sequel to when the Irish invaded Canada, which is really the story of that great hunger generation who has to flee the homeland and come to America and try to establish a new life here.
Got it. Well, I think that probably at least a couple of those would be ones that would have broad interest here, so maybe we can get you back.
Sure.
One other thing, and I think Carrie may ask about this too, but looking ahead, is there a chance that if we can get History Camp Boston happening this next year, and we're shooting for July, will you be participating?
I'd certainly hope to. Yeah. I mean, I've always enjoyed, presenting. Presenting is always, fun for me when you have an engaged audience, and that's what is really nice about presenting at History Camp, is that every single person there, of course, is a history buff and has some sort of connection to the history that they want to bring. So you get really interesting questions that are asked by the audience too. So it's great as a presenter. But then, of course, I also enjoy just being able to attend all the sessions, because it's just there's nowhere else that you're going to get such a range of diverse topics and diverse historical periods. And I think the last history camp I attended, there was a session talking about Confederate monuments and what's going to happen there. And then, you leave that and you go to a session on the history of Saturday morning cartoons that, you remember from your childhood. So, you have such a range of topics there. It's a unique program that you will not find anywhere else. And it's great that it's such a crowdsourced event, and then to be able to engage with people that have such a love of history it's a great experience as a presenter and as an attendee.
Well, thank you. We definitely, Carrie and I are keen to get going again. Real history camps. So, Carrie, you've got some questions from the audience and probably some questions of your own.
We do. First, Karen would like to know if the Irish were the first main group to immigrate to the U.S.
So you have in the real colonial period, a lot of the Irish are, call them today as a sort of Scotch Irish. They're Protestant Irish. So they're sort of the first major immigrant group. But really the first big wave, when immigration as we know it to become such a influx, it happens in the 1840s, and it is two groups. It's the Irish, who are forced to the United States because of the Great Hunger. The Germans are also coming in big numbers in the 1840s in the wake of failed revolutions in 1848. So they're a very different type of immigration. Those are more people who are fleeing persecution in their homeland, looking to come to America as a beacon of freedom. So those are the two real major immigrant groups in the 1840s. That's really what I would say is sort of the birth of American immigration that we know it when we start thinking about in terms of Ellis Island and major groups coming from overseas.
Okay, and with the Fenian Brotherhood, did any of them return to Ireland after all of this?
So, interesting enough, you do have a group of members of the Fenian Brotherhood who do not abandon this original plan of launching a revolution in Ireland. So there is this split in the organization in 1866. So just as one group is planning to launch their invasion of Canada, you do have some real longtime members who were high-ranking people in terms of the Civil War, who then start to make their way back to Ireland to try to have a revolution there. And they do try to have, in March of 1867, they launched what's called the Fenian Rising. And it is a complete and utter failure that is basically over before it starts. I mean, it was just poor timing in the middle of poor weather. They just didn't have enough people, and it fizzles out really quickly. And a lot of the Fenians who are arrested in the wake of that are American citizens. And it's interesting because it leads to a real interesting battle over international law, in that the British try these American citizens as traitors to their country. They try them as British citizens. But the Americans are making the case that these are people who renounced their citizenship when they came to be American citizenship. And it's a big diplomatic back and forth between America and Britain at the time, with the backdrop of the Alabama claim still out there this whole time, where the Americans are laying heavy pressure on the British not to try and execute these American citizens as traitors. And it will establish this precedent in American law, in international law, about the renunciation of citizenship. So it's really not until this episode that is sort of enshrined in international law that citizen of Britain who came to America becomes an American citizen is no longer considered a British citizen.
Okay, Walt would like to know if Francis Meagher was involved.
So he was not really involved much in this organization, and Marr was, a well-known American, Irish-American general in the Civil War. I'm not sure if you see it over my head here. I might have it, The Immortal Irishman, which was a book about a great biography of him written by Timothy Egan. Maher, it's not even known if he even became a member of the Fenian Brotherhood, but he really didn't have much affinity for the organization. And he ends up, after the Civil War, becoming a governor out in the Montana Territory, and really doesn't play much of a role in the organization, even though he was probably the most famous of the Irish Americans fighting in the Civil War at that time.
Okay. So for the Irish who stayed in the U.S., what was their legacy here?
So I think it's interesting. The Fenians really have three legacies, as I see them. One is they bring freedom to a part of the British Empire, just not the one they intended. Canada will gain its independence in the wake of this 1866 invasion, because the Canadians don't think the British did a great job in terms of defending their territory. So it spurs on this Canadian Confederation that happens in 1867. So the Fenian raids really play a large part in that. Second is that the Irish, this transatlantic network that's set up to gain the freedom of Ireland, that's set up by the Fenians, is still in place 50 years later when the Irish actually do gain their independence. And when the Irish Proclamation is read after the Easter Rising in 1916, very prominent mention is given to Ireland's exiled children in America, because of the money that's raised here and the weapons that are sent over do play a key role then in eventual Irish independence. So even though the Fenians don't gain their independence as they wanted to in the 1860s, it will happen a generation later. And I think that's sort of the third legacy too, is that, they faced overwhelming odds. And, usually, when you watch these movies, you get the Hollywood ending, right? People overcoming incredible odds. Well, history is not always like it is in Hollywood. You face overwhelming odds. Overwhelming odds are you're going to lose, but that doesn't mean you don't put up the fight. And I think that's part of the legacy, is that that I think the Fenians knew that they were facing long odds, but that didn't mean that they weren't going to fight, because they keep up the fight. It means they carry the torch of revolution forward. And they keep the cause alive. So they may not necessarily see the fruits of an eventual victory, but maybe their ancestors might. So I think it's an important lesson for us. Whether it's fight against cancer, fight for social justice. You may not achieve that victory in your lifetime, but you're moving the cause forward to the point where that victory might be achieved sometime in the future.
Okay, so the IRA of today, is that linked to the IRA that started at this time?
So there is a through line here. It's on the Irish side. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the 1850s will be in place when Irish independence occurs in the 1920s. And their paramilitary arm is called the Irish Republican Army, which is the same IRA as we know it up through into the times of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and to the present day. So the IRA in America is the first time you see that usage. It will fizzle out on the American side, but that Irish Republican Brotherhood that is put in place in 1858, there's a direct through line to the IRA as we know it today.
Okay. And was General Ulysses S. Grant involved in this at all?
So Grant does play a role here, mainly in terms of trying to get his former Union soldiers the heck out of Canada. So when the invasions happen in 1866, Grant is basically, he dispatches General George Meade to go up to the border to get all of them back from Canada and back into their houses in the United States. So the American government actually ends up paying the fare, the rail fare, for all the Irish to leave the Canadian border and go back home, which is controversial in its own right. He will dispatch Meade a couple of times to do this, and then of course Grant has to deal with this himself when he's president in 1870 and 1871. He will actually, in 1870, in the wake of the invasion, he'll issue a pardon to John ONeill. And John ONeill will take the pardon with the promise that he will never, ever, ever again go back into Canada. And he'll quickly break that promise again. And Grant is none too pleased about it.
All right. All right. Was there any chance of these raids succeeding? And if so, what do you imagine the results would have led to?
Okay, so really, what's the goal here of seizing Canada? So the most radical Fenians think that once they cross into Canada, they'll get the support of all the French speakers in Quebec. They'll get the support of all the Irish immigrants who are in Canada. And they think, in the words, echoing what Thomas Jefferson said in the War of 1812, that the taking of Canada will be a mere matter of marching. So they think they can get in there, they'll get enough support that they will literally hold Canada hostage and then ransom it for Ireland's independence. But that's really not the best case scenario here. I think the best case scenario in terms of what they really hope that they could do is to spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. Again, using that animosity that America had towards Great Britain at the time, and at a time of manifest destiny, when America's next logical place to expand to is going to be north to Canada. I think the Fenians think that, all right, we launch this invasion of Canada. We can then basically get American support, give Canada to the Americans, and in lieu of payment for this, the Americans then will force the British to give Ireland its independence. So that's really the best case scenario here. I mean, there's also thoughts that they can seize a part of Canadian territory and then launch privateers out onto the ocean to disrupt British shipping. But really, their best end game here is to spark some sort of Anglo-American war that they can then take advantage of.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. Definitely not an episode that I was terribly familiar with. So learned a lot here, and I think our viewers did as well. Lee, you had a comment before we wrap up? I think you're muted.
Carrie and I have really enjoyed doing this and having an opportunity to talk to Chris and the other authors. We'd love to get some feedback. So I think the email address carries ideas. Is that right? Ideas@historycamp.org. Say again?
Ideas@historycamp.org, and I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on, have you enjoyed the session so far? Which ones have you seen? Which ones did you like the most? Thoughts about what we might do going forward. And one of the puzzles for us, we've had such good speakers every week. We've been trying to figure out, how do we get the word out and encourage more people to join us and to participate. So if you have thoughts on that, we'd love to hear that too. The other thing I wanted to do was just kind of draw a link and kind of put all these things together. So you know about History Camp, the physical event, History Camp Online. An organization that Carrie and I started last year is called The Pursuit of History, and that's a nonprofit organization that is designed to make this possible and to make our history camps possible and some other things that we have on the slate. So if you'd like to learn more about that or make a donation, it's at thepursuitofhistory.org. So thanks everyone tonight. Chris, thanks to you. Carrie, thanks to you.
Thank you. And next week we will have Jane Hampton Cook with us, and she's going to tell us some great stories about suffrage. So be sure to join us then. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.